The rifle crack echoed across the valley like thunder, sending a flock of ravens exploding from the cottonwoods. Chief Marcus Thunderheart pressed himself against the rocky outcrop, his weathered hands steady on his Winchester as he counted muzzle. Flashes from the ridge above. 7 men, maybe 8, professional shooters by the sound of their weapons and the discipline of their fire pattern. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. He had been tracking elk through these Colorado mountains when the ambush began, but this wasn't about hunting rights or territorial disputes. The men above wore the dark suits and polished boots of government agents, not the rough clothes of local settlers. Their leader's voice carried clearly in the thin mountain air, calling out commands with the crisp authority of military training. Spread out along the ridge. He can't stay hidden forever. Remember, we need him alive for questioning. Marcus shifted position, moving with the fluid silence that had kept him alive through 3 decades of warfare and negotiation. At 52, his body still carried the lean strength of a warrior, though silver now streaked the long black hair that hung beneath his eagle feather war bonnet. The sacred paint on his face, white lightning bolts across his cheekbones, red circles around his eyes, marked him as what the white world called a war chief, though his people knew him simply as a protector of the helpless. Another volley of shots sent granite chips flying near his head. These men weren't trying very hard to avoid killing him, despite their leader's orders. Marcus had seen enough government work to know that alive for questioning often meant dead after talking. He drew back his bowstring, the hickory wood, creaking softly as he sighted on the nearest shooter. The arrow flew true, piercing the man's shoulder and spinning him backward with a scream of surprise. Before his companions could react, Marcus had already moved to a new position, circling through the maze of boulders that crowned this section of the Rockies. His second shot took down another agent, the arrow finding the gap between 2 rocks, where the man had thought himself safely concealed. "Jesus Christ, he's moving like a ghost up there," one of the remaining men shouted, panic creeping into his voice. "I thought you said he was just some Indian reservation." "Shut up and keep firing," their leader snapped back. Marcus Thunderheart didn't earn his reputation by accident. Stay focused. The sound of his own name, spoken with such familiarity, sent ice through Marcus's veins. These weren't random government agents sent to harass another troublesome native. Leader. They knew exactly who he was, which meant they knew what he had done during the Indian Wars 25 years ago. They knew about the cavalry regiment he had destroyed at Devil's Canyon. They knew about the wagon trains he had saved from hostile tribes. They knew about the peace treaties he had negotiated when other chiefs wanted only blood. Most of all, they knew about the promise he had made to a dying cavalry colonel named William Harrison, a promise that had cost Marcus everything he held dear and driven him into the mountains to live as a hermit for the past 5 years. The memory hit him like a physical blow, triggered by the stress of combat and the familiar weight of his weapons. October 15th, 1847, the Battle of Sage Creek. Marcus had been leading his warriors in what was supposed to be a simple raid on army supply wagons when everything went catastrophically wrong. Instead of supplies, the wagons had been full of families, settlers heading west, including women and children who screamed in terror as the battle erupted around them. Marcus had called off the attack immediately, but not before some of his younger warriors, drunk on bloodlust and the excitement of their first real fight, had broken ranks. When the dust settled, 7 settlers lay dead, including 2 children no older than 10. Marcus had stood over their bodies, the taste of ash in his mouth, while Colonel Harrison bled out from a warrior's lance, his eyes fixed on Marcus with an expression of profound disappointment rather than hatred. "You're better than this," Harrison had whispered, his voice growing weaker with each word. I've watched you, Thunderheart. You've saved more white lives than most white men. These deaths, they don't define you unless you let them." Marcus had knelt beside the dying officer, enemy though he was, moved by something in the man's tone. "What would you have me do? The damage is done." "Make it right," Harrison had gasped, blood frothing at his lips. "There are others who need protection, others who have no one. Promise me you'll use your strength to shield the innocent regardless of their skin color. Promise me you'll be the protector you were meant to be." The promise had seemed simple enough at the time. Marcus had given his word to a dying man, thinking it was just the final request of someone facing eternity. He had no idea it would tear apart everything he had built, everything he loved, everything that gave his life meaning. When Marcus returned to his village and told his people about the promise, about his intention to honor Harrison's dying wish, by protecting any innocent person who needed help, the reaction was immediate and devastating. His own warriors accused him of betraying his people for white sympathy. The tribal council, led by his own brother Joseph, declared him a traitor to his heritage and banished him from Shoshone lands. Worst of all was the reaction of his wife, Running Deer, and their 2 young sons, Eagle Soars and Little Wolf. Running Deer had looked at him with eyes full of tears and confusion, unable to understand how her husband could choose the welfare of strangers over the needs of his own family. "The whites have taken our lands, killed our buffalo, forced our children into their schools," she had said, her voice breaking with emotion. "And now you want to protect them? Have you forgotten who you are?" Marcus had tried to explain about honor, about the weight of a dying man's final words, about his belief that strength should protect weakness regardless of tribal boundaries. But his family saw only betrayal, only a man who had chosen outsiders over his own blood. The final confrontation came when Marcus announced his intention to leave the reservation to fulfill his promise. Running Deer had stood before him in their lodge, holding their sleeping sons in her arms, tears streaming down her face. "If you leave us for them," she had whispered, "don't ever come back. I won't have my children grow up wondering why their father values strangers more than his own family." Marcus had left at dawn the next morning, carrying nothing but his weapons, his horse, and the crushing weight of choosing between 2 different kinds of honor. He had not seen his wife or children since, though he heard through occasional travelers that Running Deer had remarried, and his sons now called another man father. For 5 years, he had wandered the mountains alone, keeping his promise to Harrison by helping anyone he encountered who needed protection, regardless of their race or circumstances. He had saved wagon trains from bandits, rescued lost children, and stopped more than one potential massacre. But each act of heroism only deepened his isolation, reminding him of what his choice had cost. Now, pinned down by government agents on a Colorado mountainside, Marcus wondered if this was finally where his story would end. He had always known that his reputation would eventually draw official attention, that someone in Washington would decide he was too dangerous to remain free. A bullet whined off the rock inches from his head, bringing him sharply back to the present. Whatever these men wanted with him could wait until he survived the next few minutes. Marcus counted his arrows, 6 left in his quiver, enough to even the odds if he used them wisely. He moved again, using the terrain to his advantage as he had learned during decades of mountain warfare. The agents were good, but they fought like men accustomed to pursuing criminals in cities, not warriors who had learned tactics from the land itself. Within minutes, Marcus had reduced their number to 3, his arrows finding their marks with the deadly precision that had made him legendary among both his enemies and his people. The remaining agents retreated beyond his bow range, shouting to each other as they tried to regroup. Marcus used the respite to study their faces through the scope of a rifle he had taken from one of the wounded men. The leader was a thin, pale man with the kind of soft features that spoke of a life spent behind desks rather than in the field. His companions looked more competent, with the hard eyes and scarred hands of men accustomed to violence. "Thunderheart," the leader called out, his voice echoing across the rocks. "My name is Agent William Crawford with the Bureau of Indian Affairs. We're not here to arrest you. We need your help." Marcus almost laughed at the absurdity of it. They had opened fire without warning, tried to kill him for the past hour, and now they wanted his assistance. Even by government standards, this was remarkably incompetent diplomacy. "You have an interesting way of asking for help," Marcus called back, keeping his position concealed. "Most people start with words rather than bullets." "We had to be sure you were still capable," Crawford replied. "What we're about to ask of you requires a man of exceptional skill. We needed to verify that your reputation wasn't exaggerated." Despite his cynicism about government motives, Marcus found himself curious. He had been alone in these mountains for so long that even a conversation with would-be assassins was almost welcome. What could the Bureau of Indian Affairs possibly want with an exiled war chief? "There's a situation developing in the valley below," Crawford shouted. "A woman named Sarah Mitchell, 24 years old, homesteading alone near Willow Creek. She's about to become the target of something that makes our little shootout here look like a church social." The name meant nothing to Marcus, but something in Crawford's tone suggested this was more than just another isolated incident of frontier violence. "What kind of target?" "The worst kind," Crawford replied grimly. "Have you heard of a man named Vincent Kellerman?" Marcus had indeed heard of Kellerman, and the name sent ice water through his veins. Vincent Kellerman was the most feared criminal, leader in the entire Western Territory, a man who controlled a network of outlaws, corrupt officials, and hired killers that stretched from California to Texas. Unlike common bandits who robbed for money, Kellerman specialized in what he called social engineering, destroying entire communities to serve his larger goals. Kellerman's reputation for calculated cruelty was legendary. He didn't just kill his enemies. He dismantled their entire lives first, turning friends against them, destroying their reputations, bankrupting them, and isolating them completely before delivering the final blow. Men who crossed Kellerman often ended up begging for death long before he granted it. "What does Kellerman want with one homesteader?" Marcus asked, though he suspected the answer would be complicated. "Sarah Mitchell isn't just any homesteader," Crawford replied. "She's the daughter of federal judge Robert Mitchell, the man who sentenced 3 of Kellerman's lieutenants to hang last year. The judge died of a heart attack 6 months ago, but Kellerman's vengeance isn't complete. He wants the daughter to suffer first." Marcus felt the familiar tightness in his chest that always accompanied news of innocence in danger. This was exactly the kind of situation his promise to Colonel Harrison compelled him to address, regardless of personal cost. "Why not send federal marshals? Why come to me?" "Because Kellerman has 40 men heading toward Willow Creek," Crawford answered. "Professional killers, every one of them. They're not planning a quick death for Sarah Mitchell. Kellerman wants her to experience the same terror and helplessness his men felt waiting for execution. The Marshal Service doesn't have enough men in the territory to stop them. The scope of the threat was staggering. 40 professional killers against one isolated woman. It wasn't a fight. It was a prolonged execution. Marcus had faced worse. Odds himself, but never when protecting someone else. The tactical challenges alone were nearly insurmountable. "Even if I agreed to help," Marcus said, "what could one man accomplish against such numbers?" Crawford's answer surprised him. "You wouldn't be alone. We know about your reputation among the Shoshone, about the warriors who would still follow you despite your exile. If you were to return to your people, explain the situation, rally support for protecting an innocent woman." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. My people banished me, Marcus interrupted, the old pain sharp in his voice. They consider me a traitor for honoring a white man's dying wish. They won't listen to me now. Things have changed, Crawford insisted. Your brother Joseph is no longer on the tribal council. The new leaders are men who remember your victories, who respect your courage, even if they disagreed with your choices. And there are rumors. Crawford paused, seeming to weigh his words carefully. There are rumors that Running Deer never remarried, that she's been waiting for you to come home. The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. For 5 years, he had tortured himself with images of his wife in another man's arms, his children calling someone else father. The possibility that she had remained faithful, that his family might still exist in some form, was almost too painful to contemplate. You're lying, Marcus said, though his voice lacked conviction. I'm a government agent, Crawford replied, with what might have been humor. I lie professionally, but not about this. Check for yourself if you doubt me, but do it. Quickly, Kellerman's men will reach Willow Creek in 3 days. Marcus closed his eyes, feeling the weight of another impossible choice settling on his shoulders. Sarah Mitchell was an innocent woman facing a horrible death, exactly the kind of person his promise to Harrison compelled him to protect. But helping her would mean returning to a people who had rejected him, facing a family that might no longer exist, and risking everything on the word of a government agent who had just tried to kill him. The smart choice was to walk away. He had spent 5 years learning to live with the consequences of his moral choices. One more innocent death wouldn't break him, and staying uninvolved would preserve the fragile peace he had built in his mountain solitude. But as Marcus opened his eyes and looked down toward the valley where Sarah Mitchell was presumably going about her daily life, unaware that death was riding toward her with methodical precision, he knew the choice had already been made. Colonel Harrison's dying words echoed in his memory. Use your strength to shield the innocent, regardless of their skin color. Some promises, once made, became part of a man's soul. Breaking them meant destroying something fundamental about who he was meant to be. If I go to my people, Marcus called out to Crawford, if I convince them to help, what guarantee do I have that this isn't some elaborate trap? None whatsoever, Crawford admitted with refreshing honesty. For all you know, this entire situation is designed to lure you back to Shoshone lands, where you can be eliminated more quietly. But you'll go anyway because you're Marcus Thunderheart, and protecting the innocent is what you do. The agent was right, and they both knew it. Marcus had been shaped by forces larger than personal preference or logical calculation. He was what the Shoshone called a guardian spirit, a person whose fundamental nature compelled them to stand between danger and those too weak to defend themselves. 3 days to reach Willow Creek, Marcus mused, calculating distances and travel times. That gives me 2 days to return to my people, convince them to help, and ride out with enough warriors to face Kellerman's army. Can it be done? Crawford asked. Marcus thought about his brother Joseph, about the tribal elders who had called him a traitor, about warriors who had once followed him into battle but now looked at him with suspicion and disappointment. Then he thought about Running Deer, about the possibility that she had waited for him through 5 years of exile and uncertainty. I don't know, he admitted, but I'm going to find out. As Marcus prepared to leave his mountain refuge for the first time in 5 years, he felt the familiar mixture of fear and purpose that had defined his adult life. He was 52 years old, exiled from his people, estranged from his family, and about to attempt something that would likely get him killed. But Sarah Mitchell was going to face Kellerman's killers with nothing but her own courage unless someone intervened, and if there was one thing Marcus Thunderheart understood better than anyone else, it was the weight of promises made to protect the innocent. The ride down from the mountains toward Shoshone lands would take him through territory he hadn't seen in 5 years, past familiar landmarks that would remind him of everything he had lost. But it would also carry him toward the possibility of redemption, toward a chance to prove that his choices had meaning beyond their personal cost, whether his people would listen to him, whether his family still existed, whether Sarah Mitchell could be saved. All of that lay ahead in the uncertain future. For now, Marcus had only the present moment and the decision to honor a promise that had already cost him everything once before. As he mounted his horse and began the long ride toward his past, Marcus whispered a prayer to the mountain spirits that had sheltered him through his years of exile. He was going home, but home might no longer have a place for him. The only certainty was that an innocent woman's life hung in the balance, and that was enough to justify any risk, any sacrifice, any pain that might come. The Shoshone reservation spread before Marcus like a collection of broken promises scattered across the high plains, where once hundreds of traditional lodges had dotted the landscape. Now only a few dozen wooden houses squatted in the dust, their government-issued construction already showing signs of decay after just 15 years. The American flag hung limp from a pole near the agency building, its stars and stripes faded by sun and neglect. Marcus guided his horse along the ridge overlooking his former home, studying the changes 5 years of absence had wrought. The once proud horse herds that had made the Shoshone feared across 3 territories were gone, replaced by a handful of cattle that wandered aimlessly through sagebrush. The Sacred Council Lodge, where tribal decisions had been made for generations, was now a Christian church, its cross stark against the endless sky. Most painful of all, he could see his own lodge, or what had been his lodge, standing empty on the eastern edge of the settlement. The buffalo hide covering had been replaced with canvas, and the door flap hung open like a mouth frozen in permanent surprise. No smoke rose from the center hole where his family's fire had once burned continuously. Running Deer was nowhere to be seen, nor were his sons. Marcus forced himself to consider the possibility that Agent Crawford had lied, that his family had indeed moved on, perhaps to another reservation, or even off the territory entirely. After 5 years, expecting them to wait was perhaps the ultimate expression of arrogance, but before he could confront the personal devastation of his choices, Marcus had to deal with a more immediate problem. A group of 6 warriors was riding hard toward his position, their ponies kicking up dust clouds visible for miles across the flat terrain. Even at a distance, Marcus could recognize the aggressive posture of men riding to war, their weapons ready and their faces painted for battle. He considered retreat. It would be easy enough to disappear back into the mountains before they reached him, but running would accomplish nothing except postponing an inevitable confrontation. If he was going to convince his people to help Sarah Mitchell, he would need to face their anger and disappointment head-on. Marcus rode down from the ridge to meet them, his hands visible but resting near his weapons. As the warriors drew closer, he recognized several faces from his past. Thomas Crow Feather, who had been among his most devoted followers during the Indian Wars, William Running Bear, the finest tracker among the Shoshone, and leading them, his face set in an expression of cold fury, was Marcus's younger brother, Joseph Thunderheart. Joseph had changed in 5 years. Once lean and quick-tempered, he had filled out into the solid build of a man accustomed to responsibility and hard decisions. Grey streaked his black hair now, and his face bore new lines around the eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and difficult choices. But his eyes still held the same fierce intelligence that had made him Marcus's closest advisor during their years of war and diplomacy. The warriors formed a semicircle around Marcus, their weapons drawn but not yet aimed. Joseph nudged his horse forward until he was close enough to speak without shouting, his voice carrying the authority of leadership. "Marcus Thunderheart," Joseph said formally, using the full name that indicated official business rather than family conversation. "You were banished from these lands by order of the tribal council. Your presence here violates the terms of your exile." "I know," Marcus replied simply. "I wouldn't have come if innocent lives weren't at stake." Joseph's eyes flashed with something that might have been pain. "Innocent lives? Like the innocent lives of your wife and children, who grieved for a husband and father who chose strangers over his own blood." The words cut deep, but Marcus forced himself to maintain composure. Showing weakness now would undermine any chance he had of convincing these men to listen. "How are they? Running Deer and the boys?" "They are no longer your concern," Joseph replied coldly, but something flickered in his expression, surprise perhaps, or uncertainty. "You gave up the right to ask such questions when you abandoned them." Thomas Crowfeather spoke up, his voice thick with old anger. 5 years we waited for you to come to your senses. 5 years we thought you might remember that your first duty was to your people, not to the whites who stole our lands. "My duty was to honor a dying man's final request," Marcus said quietly, "to use my strength to protect the innocent, regardless of their skin color. That promise doesn't recognize tribal boundaries. And look where it got you." William Running. Bear interjected bitterly. "Alone in the mountains, cut off from everything that gave your life meaning. Was it worth it, Marcus? Was protecting strangers worth destroying your own family?" The question had haunted Marcus every day for 5 years. He could give them philosophical answers about honor and duty, but the truth was simpler and more painful. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I'm here because a woman named Sarah Mitchell is about to die horribly unless someone helps her. She has no family, no protection, no one to stand between her and 40 professional killers." Joseph's horse shifted restlessly, responding to its rider's tension. "Another white woman, another stranger who means nothing to our people. When will it end, Marcus? When will you finally choose us over them?" "This isn't about choosing sides," Marcus said, frustration creeping into his voice. "This is about right and wrong, about using power to protect those who have none. Kellerman's men aren't coming for Sarah Mitchell because she's white. They're coming because she's helpless and alone." "Kellerman," Thomas repeated, and Marcus saw recognition flicker across several faces. Even here on the reservation, Vincent Kellerman's reputation had reached them. Joseph studied his brother's face with the careful attention of a man trying to read an opponent's intentions. "You're asking us to ride to war against Kellerman for a woman we've never met. You're asking us to risk our lives for someone who isn't our people. I'm asking you to remember what we used to believe," Marcus replied. "That strength should protect weakness, that warriors exist to shield those who cannot shield themselves. That's not white philosophy or Indian philosophy, it's human philosophy." William Running Bear spat in the dust. "Pretty words from a man who hasn't lived with the consequences of his choices. Do you know what happened after you left, Marcus? Do you know how your family suffered?" Marcus felt ice form in his stomach. "Tell me." "Running Deer stopped eating for weeks," William continued remorselessly. "She sat outside your empty lodge every morning watching the trail, waiting for you to come back. Your boys cried themselves to sleep asking when their father would return. The whole tribe watched them waste away while you were off playing hero to strangers." Each word was a knife thrust, precisely aimed to cause maximum damage. Marcus absorbed the pain without flinching, knowing that these men needed to see him suffer before they would consider listening to his request. "And then," Joseph added softly, his voice carrying a different kind of hurt, "she started asking questions we couldn't answer, like why her husband valued a white man's dying words more than his own wife's living tears. like what she had done. Wrong to make you leave, like whether you had ever really loved her at all. The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Marcus felt something break inside his chest, a wall he had built to protect himself from exactly this kind of knowledge. For 5 years, he had told himself that his family would understand eventually, that they would forgive him for honoring a higher duty. The reality was far more devastating. "Is she—" Marcus began, then stopped, afraid to finish the question. "Is she what?" Joseph demanded. "Remarried? Dead? Waiting for a man who cares more about his reputation than his children? What exactly do you want to know, brother?" Before Marcus could answer, the sound of approaching horses drew everyone's attention. A young woman was riding toward them at a full gallop, her hair streaming behind her like a war banner. As she drew closer, Marcus felt his heart stop. It was Snow Moon, Running Deer's younger sister, but she had grown from the gangly teenager he remembered into a striking woman of perhaps 25. Her resemblance to Running Deer was so strong that for a moment Marcus thought he was seeing his wife as she had been when they first met. Snow Moon pulled her horse to a sliding stop just outside the circle of warriors, her chest heaving from the hard ride. "Joseph," she called urgently, "you need to come quickly. There's been an accident at the agency." "What kind of accident?" Joseph asked, already turning his horse toward the settlement. "A government wagon overturned crossing Willow Creek," Snow Moon replied breathlessly. 3 people were thrown into the water. We pulled out 2, but there's still a woman trapped under the wagon. The current's too strong for our men to reach her safely. Marcus felt the familiar surge of purpose that always accompanied news of people in danger. Without thinking, he spurred his horse toward the settlement, leaving the warriors behind as he raced toward the creek. "Marcus, wait!" Joseph called after him, but Marcus was already cresting the first hill, his horse stretching into a full gallop. Willow Creek ran along the southern edge of the reservation, fed by mountain snowmelt that kept it running fast and cold even in late autumn. As Marcus approached, he could see the overturned government wagon wedged against a fallen cottonwood, its rear wheels spinning lazily in the current. A crowd of perhaps 30 Shoshone had gathered on the bank, pointing and shouting suggestions, but no one was in the water. Marcus dismounted while his horse was still moving, scanning the scene with the tactical eye of a man accustomed to emergencies. The wagon had overturned in the deepest part of the creek, where the current ran fastest. Whoever was trapped underneath would have been fighting the water for several minutes already. Time was running out quickly. He spotted the problem immediately. The wagon had settled at an angle that created an air pocket beneath it. But the space was narrow, and the current was powerful enough to slam a swimmer against the wooden sides with bone-breaking force. Any rescue attempt would require someone strong enough to fight the current and skilled enough to maneuver in tight spaces. "Where is she?" Marcus called to the nearest Shoshone, a middle-aged man he didn't recognize. "Under the rear of the wagon," the man replied, pointing to a section where bubbles occasionally broke the surface. "We can hear her calling, but the current's too strong. Anyone who goes in there will be crushed against the wood." Marcus was already stripping off his shirt and moccasins, his mind calculating angles and water flow. He had learned to swim in mountain streams as a child, and his years in the wilderness had kept him strong. But this would require more than strength. It would require the kind of precise timing that meant the difference between rescue and disaster. Joseph and the other warriors arrived just as Marcus was preparing to enter the water. "Marcus, don't be a fool," Joseph called urgently. "We've already lost 1 person. Don't make it 2. "She's still alive," Marcus replied, pointing to the bubbles that continued to mark the trapped woman's location. "That means there's still time." He waded into the creek, feeling the shock of the cold water against his skin. The current tried to sweep his feet out from under him immediately, But Marcus had expected that, bracing himself against the rocky bottom as he worked his way toward the overturned wagon. The closer he got to the wreckage, the stronger the current became. Marcus could feel the water's power pulling at him, trying to slam him into the same wooden prison that held the trapped woman. He took a deep breath and dove beneath the surface, following the wagon's outline until he found the narrow opening where someone might be trapped. The water was murky with disturbed sediment, making it impossible to see more than a few inches in any direction. Marcus felt his way along the wagon's underside, his lungs beginning to burn as he searched for any sign of the trapped woman. Just as he was preparing to surface for air, his hand touched something soft, fabric, and beneath it, the unmistakable outline of a human arm. Marcus grabbed the arm and pulled, but the woman was stuck fast, pinned by something he couldn't see. In the dark water, he surfaced, gasping for air, and called to the crowd on the bank. "She's pinned by debris. I need a rope." Snow Moon was already running toward the agency buildings, but Marcus knew there wasn't time to wait for proper equipment. The woman's struggles were growing weaker. She was drowning while he watched. He dove again, this time following the woman's arm to find what was holding her. His fingers encountered a piece of wooden planking that had broken loose from the wagon bed, its weight pinning her legs against the creek bottom. Marcus braced his feet against the wagon's side and pulled with all his strength, feeling the wood shift slightly but not break free. His lungs were screaming for air, but Marcus forced himself to stay underwater, repositioning himself for better leverage. This time, he planted his shoulder against the plank and drove upward with his legs, using his entire body as a lever. The wood groaned and shifted, then suddenly broke free, tumbling away in the current. The woman floated upward immediately. No longer fighting the water, Marcus grabbed her around the waist and kicked toward the surface, his vision beginning to darken from oxygen deprivation. They broke the surface together, both gasping and choking as the current swept them downstream toward calmer water. Marcus managed to get his feet under him in the shallower water, supporting the unconscious woman as he struggled toward the bank. Willing hands reached out to help, pulling both of them from the creek onto solid ground. The woman was young, perhaps 25, with auburn hair plastered to her head and skin blue from cold and oxygen deprivation. Marcus rolled her onto her side and pressed on her back, forcing creek water from her lungs until she began coughing and breathing on her own. "Is she going to be all right?" Snow Moon asked, kneeling beside them with blankets she had retrieved from the agency. Marcus checked the woman's pulse and breathing, both of which were growing stronger. "She'll live," he said, wrapping one of the blankets around her, shivering. "Form. But she needs to get warm and dry quickly." As they lifted the woman to carry her to the agency building, Marcus got his first clear look at her face. What he saw made him stop in his tracks, his heart pounding with sudden recognition. The woman had the kind of refined features that spoke of education and privilege, with high cheekbones and a determined jawline that suggested inner strength. But it was her eyes, now fluttering open, that confirmed Marcus's growing suspicion. They were the deep green of mountain lakes, intelligent and observant, even in her weakened state. "Sarah," she whispered hoarsely, trying to focus on Marcus's face. "Sarah Mitchell, thank you." Marcus felt the world shift around him as the pieces fell into place. This wasn't just any government accident. This was the woman he had come to save, delivered directly into his hands by what could only be described as divine intervention. Sarah Mitchell, the homesteader facing Kellerman's approaching army, was here on the Shoshone reservation, miles from her supposed homestead near Willow Creek. Joseph appeared at Marcus's side, his face grim with understanding. "This is her, isn't it? The woman you came to save?" Marcus nodded, still supporting Sarah's weight, as they walked toward the agency building. "Agent Crawford said she was homesteading alone. He didn't mention she was traveling with government officials. Maybe because she's not just a homesteader," Joseph said quietly, his detective instincts engaged. No frontier woman dresses like that or speaks with that kind of education. This woman has connections, Marcus, important ones. They reached the agency building, where several Shoshone women took charge of Sarah's care, providing dry clothes and hot tea while examining her for injuries. Marcus found himself standing outside the door, dripping wet and shirtless, while his brother studied him with a mixture of frustration and grudging respect. "You didn't hesitate," Joseph observed. "The moment you heard someone was in danger, you acted just like always." "Just like you would have," Marcus replied. "If I hadn't been here, you would have found another way to save her." Joseph was quiet for a long moment, watching his brother's face. 5 years, Marcus. 5 years I've been angry at you for leaving. But watching you in that water, I remembered why our warriors used to follow you into impossible battles. Why? Did people trusted you with their lives? The admission hung between them like a bridge. Neither was quite ready to cross. Marcus felt a flicker of hope that perhaps his exile didn't have to be permanent, that maybe his family and his people could find a way to forgive his choices. "There's something else," Joseph continued, lowering his voice. "Something you need to know about running deer before you see her." Marcus braced himself for another revelation that would shatter his carefully constructed emotional defenses. "What about her?" "She never remarried," Joseph said simply. Despite every pressure from the tribal council, despite offers from good, men who would have provided for her and the boys, she never took another husband. She said she was still married to a man who chose duty over family, and that until he came home or died, she would wait. The words hit Marcus like a physical blow, confirmation of both his worst fears and his deepest hopes. Running deer had sacrificed 5 years of her life, waiting for a man who might never return, raising their children alone while he pursued an abstract concept of honor among strangers. "The boys?" Marcus asked, afraid to hear the answer. "Eagle, Saws, and Little Wolf. How are they?" Joseph's expression softened slightly. "They're strong boys, Marcus. Angry, confused, hurt by your absence, but strong. Eagle Saws is 16 now, almost a man. He asks about you constantly, but pretends he doesn't care if you ever come back. Little Wolf is 13 and remembers you better than his brother. He still believes you'll return someday with a good reason for leaving." Before Marcus could respond, Snow Moon emerged from the agency building with an update on Sarah's condition. "She's awake and asking for the man who saved her," Snow Moon reported. "The agency doctor says she'll recover fully, but she insists on speaking with you immediately." Marcus looked down at his bare chest and soaked clothes, suddenly aware of how he must appear. "I should get dressed first." "No time," Snow Moon said urgently. "She says it's about Kellerman. She knows why you're here." The implications of that statement raced through Marcus's mind as he followed Snow Moon back into the agency building. If Sarah Mitchell knew about Kellerman's threat, if she understood the connection between her presence on the reservation and Marcus's sudden return from exile, then the situation was far more complex than Agent Crawford had revealed. Sarah was sitting up in bed, wrapped in traditional Shoshone blankets, her color much improved, though her hands still shook slightly from shock and cold. When Marcus entered the room, her green eyes fixed on him with an intensity that suggested she was evaluating him as much as thanking him. "Marcus Thunderheart," she said, and her voice carried the kind of authority that came from giving orders and expecting them to be obeyed. "We need to talk, privately." Joseph hesitated at the doorway. "Marcus, if this woman is involved in some kind of government conspiracy—" "5 minutes," Marcus said to his brother. "Let me hear what she has to say." When they were alone, Sarah Mitchell studied Marcus with the careful attention of someone accustomed to reading people's motivations. "You're not what I expected," she said finally. "What did you expect?" Marcus asked, genuinely curious. Agent Crawford described you as a rogue war chief driven by guilt and isolation, Sarah replied. He said you would help because you couldn't resist protecting the innocent, regardless of personal cost. But watching you in that water, you didn't hesitate for a second. That wasn't guilt or compulsion. That was the character. Marcus felt heat rise in his cheeks at the unexpected praise. Anyone would have done the same. No, Sarah said firmly, they wouldn't have. And that's why I need to tell you the truth about why I'm here. Why Kellerman really wants me dead, and why saving me is going to require more than just protecting one homesteader from 40 killers. She paused, gathering her strength, then looked directly into Marcus's eyes. My name is Sarah Mitchell, but I'm not a homesteader. I'm a federal investigator working for the Treasury Department. And Kellerman isn't after me for personal revenge. He's after me because I have evidence that could destroy his entire criminal empire and expose corruption reaching to the highest levels of government. The revelation hit Marcus like a thunderbolt. Sarah Mitchell wasn't an innocent homesteader facing random violence. She was a federal agent carrying information that could topple one of the most powerful criminal organizations in the Western Territories. The stakes weren't just one woman's life anymore. They were the future of law and order across thousands of square miles of frontier territory. What kind of evidence? Marcus asked, though he suspected the answer would complicate everything. Sarah reached into her coat and withdrew a leather document case, its contents thick with official papers and photographs. Proof that Kellerman has been working with corrupt federal officials to steal land from Native American tribes, selling it to railroad companies and mining interests for millions of dollars. Your reservation, Marcus, your people's land. It's all scheduled to be seized within the next 6 months unless someone stops him. Marcus felt the world shift beneath his feet once again. This wasn't about protecting a stranger anymore. It was about protecting his own people, his own land, everything that remained of the Shoshone heritage. Kellerman's 40 men weren't just coming to kill Sarah Mitchell. They were coming to eliminate the one person who could prevent the legal theft of an entire nation's homeland. How many people know about this evidence? Marcus asked, his mind already calculating the implications. Just me, Sarah replied grimly. And now you. Everyone else who worked on the investigation is dead. Kellerman's people have been hunting me for 3 months, and they're closing in. That government wagon didn't overturn by accident, Marcus. Someone sabotaged it to try to kill me before I could reach you. The pieces were falling into place with terrifying clarity. Agent Crawford's ambush in the mountains hadn't been a test of Marcus's abilities. It had been an attempt to eliminate him before he could link up with Sarah Mitchell. The Bureau of Indian Affairs was compromised, probably by the same corruption that Sarah had been investigating. If that's true, Marcus said slowly, then we can't trust anyone in the government. We're completely on our own. Sarah nodded grimly. 40 professional killers, unknown number of corrupt officials, and a criminal empire with unlimited resources. Against us. She looked at Marcus with something that might have been hope. Think your people will listen to you now? Marcus thought about his brother's words, about running deer waiting for 5 years, about his sons growing up without a father. Then he thought about the Shoshone reservation being stolen through legal manipulation, his people scattered to the winds like their ancestors before them. I don't know, he admitted, but I'm going to find out. The tribal council lodge had been rebuilt since Marcus's exile, its traditional circular structure now reinforced with wooden planks and crowned with a metal roof that gleamed dully in the afternoon sun. As Marcus approached the building with Sarah Mitchell at his side, he could hear voices raised in heated argument, a sound that transported him back 20 years to the days when Shoshone warriors debated whether to fight the advancing white settlements or seek accommodation through treaties. Now the debate centered on him. Through the lodge's open doorway, Marcus could see 12 men seated in the traditional circle, their faces painted with the formal designs that marked serious tribal business. Some he recognized from his youth. Grey Wolf, the eldest council member whose wisdom had guided the tribe through the transition to reservation life. Others were younger men who had risen to leadership during his absence, their unfamiliar faces marking how much had changed in 5 years. Joseph stood in the center of the circle, his voice carrying the authority of his position as war chief. My brother asks us to risk everything for a white woman we don't know, carrying secrets we don't understand, against an enemy who has never harmed our people directly. He abandoned his family and his duties 5 years ago. Why should we trust his judgment now? Because 40 armed men are riding toward our lands, replied a voice Marcus recognized with shock. Standing near the council fire was Thomas Black Elk, a childhood friend who had lost an arm fighting cavalry at the Battle of Bear River 15 years earlier. Thomas had been among Marcus's harshest critics when he announced his intention to honor Colonel Harrison's dying wish. If this Kellerman wants the woman badly enough to bring an army to our reservation, then she must carry something valuable, something worth fighting for. Grey Wolf raised his weathered hand for silence, his ancient voice carrying easily through the lodge. Thomas Black Elk speaks wisdom, but so does War Chief Joseph. The question before us is not whether this woman carries valuable secrets, but whether those secrets serve our people's interests. We have survived on this reservation by avoiding white men's wars. Why should we change that policy now? Because this isn't just a white man's war anymore, Sarah Mitchell said quietly, stepping into the lodge entrance. Her appearance caused an immediate stir among the council members, several of whom rose to their feet in surprise. Marcus moved to her side, noting how Sarah carried herself despite her recent ordeal. She had changed from the wet government traveling clothes into a simple frontier dress provided by the Shoshone women, but her bearing remained that of someone accustomed to command. More importantly, she showed no fear or deference in the presence of the tribal council, a detail that would not go unnoticed by men sensitive to any hint of condescension. You speak our language, Grey Wolf observed with interest, switching from English to Shoshone to test her understanding. Sarah replied fluently in the same tongue, her pronunciation carrying only a slight accent. I learned from a Shoshone woman named Singing Bird, who worked as a translator for the Indian Agency in Wyoming. She taught me that words have power only when they carry truth. The council members exchanged glances of surprise and grudging respect. Few white officials bothered to learn native languages, and even fewer did so well enough to hold complex conversations. Sarah's linguistic ability suggested both respect for their culture and serious preparation for this moment. What truth do you carry, Sarah Mitchell? Grey Wolf asked, settling back onto his seat with the careful movements of advanced age. Sarah opened her leather document case and withdrew a thick sheaf of papers, holding them so the council could see the official seals and stamps that marked government documents. I carry proof that Vincent Kellerman has been working with corrupt federal officials to steal Native American lands throughout the territory. Your reservation is scheduled to be declared surplus and open to white settlement. Within 6 months, every family here will be relocated to a smaller reservation in Oklahoma, with no compensation for the land your people have lived on for generations. The impact of her words was immediate and devastating. Several council members began speaking at once, their voices rising in anger and disbelief. Marcus watched Joseph's face go pale as the implications sank in. Forced relocation would mean the end of the Shoshone as a distinct people, their children scattered across hostile territory with no connection to their ancestral homeland. Show us, Thomas Black Elk demanded, his remaining hand clenched into a fist. Show us these papers. Sarah approached the council fire and spread several documents on the ground where everyone could see them. Marcus moved closer as well, studying official letterheads and legal language that confirmed his worst suspicions about government intentions. The first document was a survey report claiming that the Shoshone reservation contained significant mineral deposits essential to national defense, making it necessary to relocate the tribe for security reasons. The second was a proposed railroad route that would run directly through the heart of their lands, connecting Denver to the Pacific coast through the most valuable sections of their territory. Most damning of all was a series of correspondence between federal officials and Vincent Kellerman's business associates, discussing payment schedules and profit-sharing arrangements for the development of former Shoshone lands. The documents revealed a conspiracy reaching from local Indian agents all the way to Washington, D.C., with millions of dollars at stake. "This cannot be legal," Grey Wolf said slowly, his finger tracing the official seals on the documents. "We have treaties, promises made in good faith." "Treaties that can be broken by congressional action," Sarah replied grimly. "The Indian Removal Act gives the federal government broad powers to relocate tribes for their own protection. Kellerman's people have been working for 3 years to create justifications for invoking that law." Marcus studied the railroad survey maps, noting how the proposed route would bisect the reservation's best agricultural land and cut off access to the sacred sites where his people had practiced their ceremonies for centuries. This wasn't just theft, it was cultural genocide, the systematic destruction of everything that made the Shoshone a distinct people. "How did you obtain these documents?" Joseph asked suspiciously. "Federal agents don't typically share such information." "With Treasury investigators." Sarah's expression hardened. "I obtained them from the office of Deputy Secretary Harrison Williams after he tried to have me killed. Williams has been coordinating the entire operation from Washington, using his position to provide legal cover for Kellerman's activities. When I got too close to the truth, he ordered my elimination." The name Harrison Williams sent a chill through Marcus's memory. He had heard that name before, in connection with several controversial Indian policy decisions that had resulted in tribal lands being open to white development. If Williams was indeed coordinating a conspiracy of this magnitude, then Sarah's evidence represented more than just local corruption. It revealed a systematic attack on Native American sovereignty throughout the Western Territories. "Assuming these documents are genuine," Grey Wolf said carefully, "what exactly are you proposing we do? Fight the United States government? We have tried that path before. It leads only to death and defeat." "I'm proposing we expose the corruption before the land theft can be legalized," Sarah replied. "I have contacts in Washington who aren't part of the conspiracy, federal judges who would issue injunctions against the relocation if they saw this evidence. But I need to survive long enough to reach them." Thomas Black Elk leaned forward, his scarred face intense with interest. "And you believe Kellerman's 40 men will prevent that survival?" "I know they will," Sarah said bluntly. "They've already killed 6 federal investigators, 2 federal judges, and an unknown number of tribal leaders who opposed similar schemes in other territories. Kellerman doesn't just steal land, he eliminates anyone who might interfere with his operations." The lodge fell silent as the council members absorbed the full scope of the threat they faced. This wasn't a simple matter of helping a stranger in need. It was a fight for their people's very existence, disguised as a rescue mission. Marcus found himself studying the faces around the council fire, reading the mix of fear, anger, and calculation in their expressions. These were good men, but they were also practical leaders who had kept their people alive through 20 years of increasingly hostile government policies. Asking them to risk everything on the word of a white woman carrying documents that could The forgeries required more than logical arguments. It required trust. Marcus Thunderheart, Grey Wolf said formally, turning to address him directly. You have heard Sarah Mitchell's words and examined her evidence. You know our people and our capabilities. What counsel do you offer? The question carried enormous weight. Grey Wolf was essentially asking Marcus to reassume his role as war chief, to provide strategic guidance for a decision that could determine the tribe's future. But accepting that role would mean taking responsibility, not just for the outcome of the battle, but for the welfare of every Shoshone family on the reservation. Marcus rose and moved to the center of the circle, feeling the eyes of 12 leaders fixed upon him with varying degrees of hope, skepticism, and barely controlled anger. These men remembered him as a warrior and a protector, but they also remembered him as someone who had chosen outsiders over his own people when the choice became necessary. 5 years ago, I made a promise to a dying cavalry officer. Marcus began, his voice carrying clearly through the lodge. I promised to use my strength to protect the innocent, regardless of their skin color or tribal affiliation. That promise cost me my family, my position among you, and my place in the only community I had ever known. Several council members shifted uncomfortably, remembering the pain and controversy of his departure. Joseph's expression remained carefully neutral, but Marcus could see the old hurt still burning in his brother's eyes. I have spent 5 years honoring that promise, Marcus continued. I have protected wagon trains from bandits, saved lost children, and prevented 3 separate massacres that would have brought cavalry retaliation against innocent tribes. But every act of protection has reminded me of what I lost when I chose duty over family. He paused, looking directly at Joseph. I thought I was serving a higher purpose, but I was serving an abstract ideal while my real responsibilities suffered. Sarah Mitchell's evidence changes that equation. Now my duty to protect the innocent and my duty to protect my people point in the same direction. Marcus gestured toward the document spread around the council fire. Kellerman's conspiracy threatens every Native American tribe in the territory. If he succeeds in stealing our lands, he will use the same methods against the Crow, the Cheyenne, the Arapaho, and every other people who stand between him and profit. Stopping him here means protecting not just the Shoshone, but every indigenous community in the region. Thomas Black Elk nodded slowly. You speak of protecting other tribes, but what about protecting ourselves? 40 professional killers against however many warriors we can muster. Those are not favorable odds. The odds become more favorable when you consider that we wouldn't be fighting alone, Marcus replied. Sarah's evidence implicates corrupt officials throughout the territorial government. There are honest federal marshals, honest judges, honest military officers who would support us if they knew the truth. Our job isn't to defeat Kellerman's army in open battle. It's to keep Sarah alive long enough to expose the conspiracy. Grey Wolf stroked his chin thoughtfully. A defensive action, rather than an offensive campaign. Protect the woman until help arrives. But what if help doesn't arrive? What if the corruption reaches deeper than we suspect? It was a fair question, and Marcus didn't have a completely satisfactory answer. Government corruption in the territories was notoriously widespread, and there was no guarantee that Sarah's contacts in Washington would be able or willing to act on her evidence. Then we fight for our people and our land with whatever allies we can find, Marcus said simply, but we fight knowing that we tried every peaceful option first. The discussion that followed lasted nearly 2 hours, with each council member voicing concerns, asking questions, and debating the risks and benefits of various courses of action. Sarah answered their questions with impressive knowledge of federal law, government procedures, and the specific officials involved in the conspiracy. Her expertise gradually convinced even the most skeptical council members that she was indeed a legitimate federal investigator rather than an agent provocateur. As the afternoon wore on, Marcus found himself falling back into the familiar rhythms of tribal decision-making, contributing strategic insights and helping to build consensus around a practical plan of action. It felt strangely natural, as if the 5 years of exile had been nothing more than an extended hunting trip. Finally, Grey Wolf called for a formal vote. All those in favor of offering protection to Sarah Mitchell and fighting to expose the land theft conspiracy, raise your hands. 9 hands rose immediately. 2 council members abstained, and 1, a younger man named David Swift Horse, voted against the proposal. The decision is made, Grey Wolf announced formally. The Shoshone people will stand with Sarah Mitchell against Vincent Kellerman. Marcus Thunderheart, will you accept the position of war chief for this conflict? The offer hung in the air like smoke from a sacred fire. Accepting would mean taking responsibility for planning and executing a military campaign that could determine his people's survival. It would also mean resuming his place in the tribal hierarchy with all the privileges and obligations that entailed. But more than that, it would mean confronting the personal consequences of his 5-year absence. His family, his children, the wife who had waited for him despite every reason to give up hope. All of them would have to deal with the reality of his return and the choices that had driven him away. I accept, Marcus said quietly, but I accept with the understanding that this is a temporary appointment. When the crisis is resolved, the council will need to decide whether my past actions have earned the right to permanent leadership. Joseph stepped forward, his expression complex but no longer hostile. Brother, you have the council's support, but you also have my challenge. Prove to us that you can put our people first when the choice becomes necessary. Prove that the man who left 5 years ago has learned from his mistakes. The challenge was fair and expected. Joseph had held the war chief position during Marcus's absence, and he deserved the chance to see whether his older brother had truly changed or simply found a convenient excuse to return. I will prove it through actions, not words, Marcus replied, extending his hand to his brother. And I will prove it while standing beside you, not above you. This fight will require both of us. Joseph clasped his hand, the gesture formal but genuine. Then let us begin planning. Kellerman's men could arrive as early as tomorrow evening. As the council members began dispersing to spread word of the decision and organize the tribe's defenses, Sarah approached Marcus with an expression of cautious relief. Thank you, she said simply. I know what this choice cost you to make. The choice was made 5 years ago, Marcus replied. Today was just the first time the 2 halves of my duty pointed in the same direction. Sarah studied his face with the careful attention of someone accustomed to reading people's motivations. Your brother is right to challenge you. A lot of people are going to die in the next few days. Your people will blame you if this goes wrong. Marcus felt the familiar weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders, but this time it felt different, heavier, but also more complete. For 5 years, he had carried the burden of protecting strangers while abandoning his own community. Now he was fighting for both his people and his principles, with no contradiction between them. Then we'll have to make sure it goes right, he said. How much time do we have before Kellerman's army arrives? Sarah consulted a pocket watch, her expression grim. 18 hours, maybe 20 if we're lucky. They'll push hard to reach us before we can organize effective resistance. 18 hours to prepare a defense, rally the warriors, and create fortifications capable of holding off professional killers. The timeline was almost impossibly tight, but Marcus had worked with worse odds during the Indian Wars. Come on, he said, heading toward the lodge entrance. You need to meet some people, and I need to see my family." The words sent a chill of anticipation and fear through Marcus's chest. After 5 years of absence, he was about to face the wife and children he had abandoned for an abstract concept of honor. Whether they would welcome him home or reject him entirely remained to be seen. But whatever happened, it would happen while he stood ready to defend them against an enemy who threatened everything they held dear. For the first time in 5 years, Marcus Thunderheart was exactly where he needed to be, fighting for exactly the right reasons. The sun was beginning to set over the reservation, painting the sky in shades of red and gold that reminded Marcus of war paint and sacred fires. Tomorrow would bring battle, but tonight was for reunion, preparation, and the hard work of rebuilding trust between a warrior and the people who had never stopped believing he might someday come home. The lodge that had once been Marcus's home stood like a monument to interrupted lives. As he approached the familiar structure in the gathering dusk, he could see warm lamplight glowing through the windows and smell the distinctive aroma of sage and sweetgrass that Running Deer had always burned during her evening prayers. But something else caught his attention. The sound of voices inside, young male voices raised in what sounded like a heated argument. Marcus paused at the door flap, uncertainty flooding through him. For 5 years, he had imagined this moment, rehearsing conversations and explanations that now seemed inadequate in the face of reality. How do you apologize to children who have grown up without a father? How do you explain to a wife that honor required abandoning the people you loved most? "I don't care what Uncle Joseph says," a voice declared from inside the lodge, high-pitched with adolescent emotion. "If he comes back now, it's only because he needs something from us. He didn't care about our family for 5 years. Why should we care about him now?" Marcus recognized the voice as belonging to his eldest son, Eagle Soars, though it had deepened significantly since their last conversation. The bitterness in the boy's tone cut deep, but Marcus forced himself to listen. Maybe he had reasons. A younger voice replied, Little Wolf, now 13, and apparently still willing to defend his absent father. Ma always said he was protecting people who couldn't protect themselves. Maybe he's been doing important work. Important work? Eagle Soars scoffed. More important than his own children? More important than watching his sons grow up? I've been the man of this house for 5 years, Little Wolf. I've hunted for our food, protected Ma from the men who tried to court her, and listened to her cry at night when she thought we couldn't hear. Where was our father's important work then? The accusation hit Marcus like a physical blow. He had known intellectually that his absence would affect his family, but hearing the pain in his son's voice made the consequences devastatingly real. Eagle Soars had been forced to assume adult responsibilities at 11 years old, becoming the family protector, while his father roamed the wilderness helping strangers. "Boys, that's enough," came a third voice. Running Deer herself, her tone, carrying the authority of a woman accustomed to maintaining peace in a household full of strong personalities. "Your father made his choices for reasons we may never fully understand. Hating him won't change the past, and it won't help us deal with whatever brought him back now." Marcus took a deep breath and pushed aside the door flap, stepping into the warm glow of his former home. The interior was exactly as he remembered, buffalo robes arranged around a central fire pit, his father's war shield hanging from the lodge poles, Running Deer's beadwork supplies organized in neat bundles along the walls. But the people inside had changed dramatically. Eagle Soars had grown tall and lean, his face showing the angular features that would mark him as a handsome man in a few more years. His hair was braided in the traditional warrior style, and Marcus could see the beginning of his first mustache darkening his upper lip. But it was the boy's eyes that shocked Marcus most. They held the cold wariness of someone who had learned not to trust easily. Little Wolf had inherited more of his mother's features, with a rounder face and the kind of open expression that suggested he still viewed the world with optimism. But even he studied Marcus with uncertainty, as if trying to reconcile memory with reality, and running deer. Marcus felt his breath catch as he looked at his wife for the first time in 5 years. She was 37 now, still beautiful, but marked by the kind of quiet strength that came from carrying burdens alone. Her long black hair showed threads of silver, and new lines around her eyes spoke of sleepless nights and difficult decisions. But when their gazes met across the fire, Marcus saw something that made his heart race, not the cold rejection he had feared, but a complex mixture of pain, hope, and carefully guarded love. "Father?" Little Wolf said quietly, rising from his seat with the uncertain movements of a boy, unsure of the proper etiquette for greeting a parent who had become a stranger. Marcus knelt and opened his arms, hoping his younger son would accept the invitation. After a moment's hesitation, Little Wolf stepped forward and allowed himself to be embraced, though his body remained stiff with uncertainty. Eagle Soars stayed seated, his arms crossed, and his expression hostile. "So you came back," he said flatly. "Congratulations, you have perfect timing. Just when we've learned to live without you, here you are, ready to disrupt everything again." The words stung, but Marcus forced himself to meet his elder son's gaze directly. "You have every right to be angry. I failed you as a father, and I failed your mother as a husband. I won't insult you by making excuses." "Good," Eagle Soars replied coldly, "because I wouldn't believe them anyway." Running Deer moved between them, her presence immediately calming the tension in the lodge. "Eagle Soars, show respect. Whatever else he may be, he is still your father." She turned to Marcus, her expression unreadable. "Why have you returned? Marcus, what has brought you back to us after all this time?" The question deserved complete honesty, regardless of how painful the truth might be. "A federal investigator named Sarah Mitchell is carrying evidence that could prevent our people's lands from being stolen. Vincent Kellerman is bringing 40 men to kill her and destroy that evidence. The tribal council has asked me to help organize our defense." Running Deer's eyebrows rose slightly. "So you came back for the tribe, not for your family?" "I came back because for the first time in 5 years, protecting strangers and protecting my people require the same actions," Marcus replied carefully. "But I would be lying if I said seeing you and the boys again wasn't the most important part of my decision." Eagle Soars snorted derisively. "How convenient. The great war chief gets to play hero and reconcile with his family at the same time. Tell me, Father, what happens when the next crisis comes along? What happens when duty calls you away from us again?" The question struck at the heart of Marcus's deepest fears. He had no guarantee that future situations wouldn't force him to choose between his family and his principles again. The promise he had made to Colonel Harrison hadn't expired, and there would always be innocent people who needed protection. "I don't know," Marcus admitted. "I can't promise that situations won't arise where my conscience demands action that might take me away from you. But I can promise that I'll never again leave without discussing it with your mother, and I'll never again make such decisions without considering their impact on our family." Running Deer studied his face with the careful attention of someone who had learned to read the truth behind words. "That's not the same as promising to stay." "No," Marcus agreed. "It's not. I won't make promises I might not be able to keep." The honesty seemed to surprise both his wife and his sons. Eagle Soars uncrossed his arms, his hostility giving way to something that might have been grudging respect. "At least you're not lying to us," the boy said quietly. "That's more than most men would do." Before Marcus could respond, urgent voices outside the lodge drew their attention. Through the open door flap, they could see warriors running between the buildings, their movements suggesting some kind of emergency. Marcus stepped outside, followed by his family, to find Thomas Black Elk approaching at a run. The one-armed warrior's face was grim with bad news. "Marcus, we have a problem," Thomas called as he drew near. "3 of our scouts haven't returned from their patrol. They were supposed to report back an hour ago. The implications were immediately clear. Either the scouts had encountered Kellerman's advance guard and been killed, or they had been captured, and were being forced to reveal information about the tribe's defenses. In either case, the enemy was closer than expected." "How far out were they patrolling?" Marcus asked, his mind already shifting to tactical considerations. "The northern ridges, about 5 miles from the reservation boundary," Thomas replied. "If Kellerman's men took them alive, they would know our numbers, our defensive positions, and our plans." Marcus felt ice form in his stomach. The Shoshone defense strategy had been based on the assumption that they would have time to prepare, that Kellerman's army would approach openly and give them warning. If the enemy had captured their scouts, all of those assumptions were invalid. "We need to assume they're coming tonight," Marcus said grimly. "How many warriors do we have ready for battle?" 43 men capable of fighting," Thomas replied, "plus maybe 20 older boys who can handle weapons, but haven't been tested in real combat." The numbers were not encouraging. 63 defenders against 40 professional killers, with nearly a third of the defending force being inexperienced youth. Worse, the Shoshone warriors were armed primarily with traditional weapons, bows, lances, and tomahawks, while Kellerman's men would have modern rifles and unlimited ammunition. Eagle Soars stepped forward, his young face set with determination. "I can fight. I've been hunting for 5 years, and I'm a good shot with both bow and rifle." Marcus felt pride and terror in his chest. His 16-year-old son was indeed skilled with weapons, but the idea of putting him in battle against professional killers was almost unbearable. "This isn't a hunting expedition," Marcus said gently. "These are men who kill for a living. They won't hesitate to put a bullet through a boy who's threatening them. And they won't hesitate to kill everyone on this reservation if we don't stop them." Eagle Soars replied with startling maturity. "I'm not asking for your permission, Father. I'm telling you what I'm going to do." Running Deer placed a hand on her son's shoulder, her expression reflecting her own internal struggle between maternal protection and practical necessity. "Eagle Soars is right," she said quietly. "This is his home too. He has the right to defend it." Before Marcus could respond, another commotion erupted near the tribal council lodge. Looking in that direction, they could see Sarah Mitchell emerging from the building in animated conversation with Joseph and several council members. Even at a distance, her body language suggested urgent concern. "Come on," Marcus said, heading toward the group. "Something else has happened." As they approached, Sarah noticed Marcus and hurried to meet him. "We have a problem," she said without preamble. "I've been analyzing the documents more carefully, and I've found something that changes everything." She pulled out a small leather journal and flipped to a page covered with handwritten notes. "The land theft conspiracy is larger than I thought. Kellerman isn't just working with corrupt federal officials, he's working with foreign investors, British mining companies specifically, who want access to the mineral deposits under your reservation." Marcus felt the world shift around him. As the implications became clear, foreign involvement makes this an international incident. It's not just corruption anymore, it's potentially treason. "Exactly," Sarah confirmed. "Which means the corrupt officials involved have even more reason to ensure that my evidence never reaches Washington. They're not just protecting their careers anymore. They're protecting themselves from execution for high treason." Joseph joined their conversation, his expression grim. "What does this mean for our immediate situation?" Sarah's answer was not encouraging. It means they'll spare no expense and accept no risks in hunting me down. Kellerman's 40 men are just the beginning. If they fail, he'll bring 100 men. If they fail, he'll bring the entire territorial militia with fabricated justification about Indian uprisings. The scope of the threat was staggering. The Shoshone weren't just facing a criminal conspiracy. They were facing enemies with unlimited resources and the backing of foreign governments. Winning one battle wouldn't end the conflict. It would only escalate the response. There's something else, Sarah continued, lowering her voice. The journal contains financial records showing payments to specific military officers for providing weapons and intelligence to Kellerman's organization. Your people aren't just facing criminals, you're facing traitors who know military tactics and have access to army weapons. Marcus felt the last of his strategic assumptions crumble. He had been planning to defend against ordinary outlaws using guerrilla tactics that had worked against cavalry during the Indian Wars. But if Kellerman's force included trained military officers with modern weapons and tactical knowledge, those same tactics might prove inadequate. "How much time do we have?" he asked, though he suspected the answer would be worse than expected. Sarah checked her pocket watch, her expression grim. "Based on the timeline in these documents, they should be in position to attack by midnight, 6 hours from now." The timeline was impossibly short. Marcus needed to completely revise his defensive strategy, redeploy his warriors, and prepare for an enemy that was better armed, better trained, and more dangerous than he had anticipated. And he needed to do it all while dealing with family, drama, and the emotional complexity of returning home after 5 years. "Can we evacuate?" Running Deer asked, clearly thinking about the women and children who would be helpless targets in the coming battle. "Where would we go?" Thomas Black Elk replied bitterly. "This is our land. These are our homes. Running away means letting them steal everything we have left." Marcus studied the faces around him, reading the mixture of fear, determination, and desperate hope in their expressions. These people were looking to him for leadership, for a plan that could somehow overcome impossible odds and protect everything they held dear. The smart, tactical decision would be to evacuate the non-combatants and conduct a fighting retreat into the mountains. It would save lives and preserve the core of the tribe for future resistance, but it would also mean abandoning their homeland to foreign thieves and corrupt officials, setting a precedent that would encourage similar attacks throughout the territory. "We stay and fight," Marcus decided. "But we fight smart. We use every advantage we have, knowledge of the terrain, support from the civilian population, and the element of surprise." "What element of surprise?" Joseph asked skeptically. "If they captured our scouts, they know we're expecting them." Marcus allowed himself a grim smile. "They know we're expecting them. They don't know we're expecting them tonight, and they certainly don't know we're expecting an enemy force that includes military officers and foreign backing." He turned to Sarah, an idea beginning to form in his mind. "Those financial records you mentioned, do they include specific names and payment amounts?" "Complete details," Sarah confirmed. "Names, dates, amounts, even bank account numbers in some cases." "Then we have leverage," Marcus said, his confidence growing as the plan crystallized. "Military officers who are taking foreign money to betray their own government have made themselves vulnerable to blackmail. If we can identify the traitors in Kellerman's force and turn them against their commander—" "You want to fight corruption with corruption," Sarah observed, understanding his strategy immediately. "I want to fight pragmatically," Marcus corrected. "These officers committed treason for money. If we can convince them that betraying Kellerman serves their financial interests better than loyalty, we might be able to split their forces." Joseph nodded slowly, beginning to see the possibilities. Divide the enemy, turn their strength into weakness. But it requires getting close enough to communicate with them, which means taking enormous risks. Everything about this situation requires enormous risks, Marcus replied. The question is whether we take calculated risks or desperate ones. As they continued planning, Marcus became aware of activity throughout the reservation as word of the approaching attack spread. Women were gathering essential supplies and preparing to shelter with their children in the most defensible buildings. Warriors were checking weapons and coordinating with their assigned defensive positions. Elders were performing blessing ceremonies to give spiritual protection to the fighters, but most striking was the transformation in his own family. Eagle Soars had disappeared briefly and returned wearing his grandfather's war paint, white lightning bolts across his cheekbones and red circles around his eyes, the same design Marcus himself wore. Little Wolf was helping his mother organize medical supplies, his face set with the kind of determined concentration that reminded Marcus powerfully of Running Deer in her youth. And Running Deer herself had changed from her daily clothes into the traditional dress of a warrior's wife, deerskin decorated with protective symbols and blessed by tribal medicine men. She moved with the quiet efficiency of someone who had prepared for this kind of crisis before, during the uncertain years when cavalry attacks on reservations were a constant threat. "Ma," Little Wolf said quietly, "are we going to be all right?" Running Deer knelt beside her younger son, taking his face in her hands with infinite gentleness. "I don't know," she admitted. "But we're going to face whatever comes together, as a family, and we're going to fight for our home and our people with everything we have." Marcus felt his throat tighten with emotion as he watched his wife comfort their son. For 5 years, she had handled every crisis alone, providing strength and stability for their children, while he pursued abstract concepts of honor among strangers. Now, finally, he was here to share the burden, but it was a burden that might destroy everything they had tried to preserve. "Running Deer," he said softly, approaching his family group, "I know I have no right to ask anything of you after the way I left, but I need to know, whatever happens tonight, can you forgive me for putting our family through 5 years of uncertainty?" She looked at him for a long moment, her dark eyes reflecting the firelight and the weight of accumulated pain. "I stopped being angry at you 3 years ago," she said finally. "I realized that hating you was hurting our children more than your absence was. But forgiveness, that's something that has to be earned through actions, not words." "Then I'll earn it," Marcus promised, "starting tonight." As midnight approached and the sounds of preparation grew more urgent throughout the reservation, Marcus felt the familiar mixture of fear and purpose that preceded every battle. But this time was different. This time he wasn't fighting for abstract principles or dying strangers' wishes. He was fighting for his family, his people, and his chance at redemption. In 6 hours, Vincent Kellerman's army would test every skill Marcus had learned in 30 years of warfare. But more than that, they would test his ability to be the man his family needed him to be. Not just a warrior, but a father, a husband, and a leader who could put his people's welfare above his own need for heroic gesture. The web of corruption that Sarah had uncovered was larger and more dangerous than anyone had imagined, but at its heart it was still a conflict between those who used power to exploit others and those who used it to protect them. And in that fundamental struggle, Marcus knew which side he belonged on. The attack came not at midnight, but in the dark hour before dawn, when human alertness was at its lowest ebb. Marcus had positioned himself on the highest ridge overlooking the reservation, watching for signs of Kellerman's approach, when the first muzzle flashes erupted from 3 different directions simultaneously. The professional killers had surrounded the settlement during the night, moving with the stealth of men who understood that victory depended on eliminating resistance before it could organize. Rifle fire exploded across the peaceful reservation like thunder splitting the sky. Marcus watched in horror as wooden buildings burst into flame, their government-issued construction proving tragically vulnerable to incendiary rounds. Women's screams and children's cries pierced the night air as families fled their burning homes, seeking shelter in the few stone buildings that offered any protection against the withering crossfire. They're not just trying to kill Sarah, Marcus realized with sickening clarity. They're trying to massacre everyone who might have seen her evidence. The scope of Kellerman's plan was becoming devastatingly clear. This wasn't a surgical strike. To eliminate a single federal investigator, it was a systematic slaughter designed to eliminate every potential witness to the conspiracy. Men, women, children, elders. Everyone on the reservation was marked for death to ensure that Sarah Mitchell's secrets died with her. Marcus slid down from his observation post and raced toward the battle, his mind cataloguing the tactical situation. As he ran, Kellerman's forces had achieved complete surprise, attacking from positions that allowed them to pin down the Shoshone defenders while setting fire to any structure that might provide cover. Worse, the enemy was using military tactics, coordinated fire teams, disciplined advance patterns, and systematic destruction of defensive positions. As Marcus reached the edge of the settlement, a bullet whined past his ear, close enough that he could feel the heat of its passage. He dove behind an overturned wagon just as a second shot splintered the wood inches from his head. Across the chaotic battlefield, he could see Joseph trying to rally a group of young warriors near the council lodge, but they were pinned down by accurate rifle fire from at least 6 different positions. "Marcus!" a familiar voice called from nearby. Thomas Black Elk was crouched behind a pile of grain sacks, his single arm working frantically to reload an old cavalry carbine. "They've got military sharpshooters positioned on all the high ground. Our boys can't move without getting cut down." The confirmation of Marcus's worst fears sent ice through his veins. Kellerman hadn't just brought professional killers. He had brought trained soldiers who understood how to coordinate an assault against defensive positions. The Shoshone warriors, brave as they were, had never faced this kind of disciplined military attack. "Where's Sarah?" Marcus called back, ducking as another volley of shots peppered their position. "In the root cellar behind the agency building, with the women and children," Thomas replied. "But they've got the building surrounded. It's only a matter of time before they break through." Marcus made a swift, tactical assessment. The Shoshone were outnumbered, outgunned, and caught in a killing zone that gave them no room to maneuver. Their traditional fighting methods, individual heroics and small unit tactics, were useless against an enemy that fought with military precision and overwhelming firepower. Unless something changed quickly, the massacre would be complete within the hour. But as Marcus watched Kellerman's forces methodically destroying the reservation, he noticed something that gave him hope. The attackers were moving with the kind of rigid discipline that came from extensive military training, but that same discipline made them predictable. They were following a textbook assault pattern, which meant Marcus could anticipate their next moves. "Thomas!" he called urgently. "Can you get word to Joseph without exposing yourself?" "Maybe," Thomas replied, squinting across the battlefield. "What do you want him to know?" "Tell him to pull all our fighters back to the sacred ground behind the council lodge. Tell him we're going to make our stand there." Thomas looked at him as if he had lost his mind. "Marcus, that ground is completely exposed. There's no cover, no defensive advantage. It's suicide. It's also the last place Kellerman's military advisors would expect us to retreat to," Marcus replied grimly. "Sometimes the most dangerous tactic is the one that makes no tactical sense." Before Thomas could protest further, Marcus was moving again, using the burning buildings as cover while he worked his way toward the agency structure where Sarah and the other non-combatants were trapped. The heat from the fires was intense, and smoke filled the air so thickly that visibility was reduced to mere yards. But the chaos also provided concealment, allowing Marcus to approach the enemy positions without being seen. As he drew closer to the agency building, Marcus could see the efficiency with which Kellerman's men were working. They had established overlapping fields of fire that covered every possible escape route, while using disciplined fire teams to maintain constant pressure on any Shoshone who tried to fight back. These weren't random criminals. They were professional soldiers operating under military command. But professionals also followed procedures, and procedures could be exploited by someone who understood them. Marcus had fought both with and against the U.S. military for decades, and he recognized the assault pattern Kellerman's forces were using. It was designed to minimize casualties among the attackers while maximizing destruction of the defenders, a textbook approach for overwhelming inferior forces. The weakness in the pattern was its predictability. The assault teams would advance in coordinated rushes, with one group providing covering fire while another moved forward. But between rushes, there would be brief moments when specific positions were vulnerable to counterattack from unexpected directions. Marcus timed his approach to coincide with one of these tactical pauses, sprinting across open ground while the enemy fire teams were repositioning. He reached the back wall of the agency building just as the next assault phase began, using the cover of renewed gunfire to mask his movements. Inside the building, he could hear voices, children crying, women praying, and over it all, Sarah Mitchell's voice, providing what sounded like tactical instructions. Marcus worked his way around to a window and peered inside to see a remarkable scene. Sarah had organized the women and children into an effective defensive formation. The older women were positioned near windows with hunting rifles, while younger women were preparing improvised weapons and medical supplies. Children too young to fight were clustered in the center of the room, protected by a barrier of overturned furniture and grain sacks. But most remarkable was Sarah herself. She had abandoned any pretense of being a helpless victim and was clearly functioning as a military commander, directing the civilian defenders with the authority of someone accustomed to combat leadership. Marcus realized he had been thinking of her as a federal investigator who needed protection, when in reality she was a trained operative capable of holding her own in battle. "Sarah," he called softly through the window, hoping not to startle the armed women inside. "It's Marcus." "Thunderheart." Sarah's face appeared at the window immediately, her expression showing relief mixed with grim determination. "Marcus, thank God. How bad is it out there?" "Bad," he admitted. "Kellerman brought military professionals. They're using coordinated assault tactics, and our warriors are taking heavy casualties. We need to break their pattern somehow. Or this becomes a massacre." Sarah nodded grimly. "I've been analyzing their attack pattern from the sound of their weapons. They're using standard cavalry assault doctrine, which means they'll try to overrun us in the next phase. We have maybe 10 minutes before they make their final push." The confirmation of Marcus's tactical assessment was both reassuring and terrifying. If Sarah was right, the battle would be decided within minutes, and the Shoshone were currently losing badly. "I have an idea," Marcus said urgently, "but it requires splitting our forces at the worst possible moment. Can you hold this position? With the women and children?" "For how long?" Sarah asked practically. Marcus calculated rapidly, considering distances, timing, and the movements required for his desperate plan to work. 20 minutes. Maybe 30, if you can make them think you're more heavily defended than you actually are. Sarah's smile was grim but confident. "I can give you 30 minutes. These women know how to fight when their children are threatened. What do you need from us?" "Make noise," Marcus replied. "Lots of it. I want Kellerman's men to think this building contains our main defensive force. Keep them focused on you while I try something incredibly stupid." Before Sarah could ask for details, Marcus was moving again, working his way back through the smoky chaos toward the sacred ground behind the council lodge. His plan was indeed incredibly stupid. So stupid that it might actually work against an enemy that expected rational tactical decisions. As he ran, Marcus could see the devastating effectiveness of Kellerman's assault. 3 Shoshone warriors lay motionless near the overturned wagon where he had first taken cover. 2 more were wounded and crawling toward whatever shelter they could find. The enemy's disciplined fire was systematically eliminating resistance while minimizing their own exposure to return fire. But Marcus also noticed something else. The attackers were beginning to bunch up as they prepared for their final assault. Military doctrine called for concentration of force during the decisive phase of an attack, which made tactical sense, but also created opportunities for anyone bold enough to exploit them. Marcus reached the sacred ground to find Joseph and 15 surviving warriors gathered in a tight defensive circle, their faces grim with the knowledge that they were probably making their last stand. The ancient ceremonial site offered no cover except for a few large stones that marked the cardinal directions, but it was also the highest point on the reservation, providing clear fields of fire in all directions. "Brother," Joseph called as Marcus approached, "I hope you have a miracle because we're about to need one." "Not a miracle," Marcus replied, checking his weapons one final time. "Just a calculated gamble based on the enemy's predictable tactics." He quickly outlined his plan to the gathered warriors, watching their expressions shift from desperation to incredulous hope. What he was proposing violated every principle of defensive warfare, but it also offered their only chance of breaking. Kellerman's methodical assault. "You're asking us to do the exact opposite of what any sane warrior would do," Thomas Black Elk observed. "I'm asking you to do something so insane that professional soldiers won't anticipate it," Marcus corrected. "Their training is their strength, but it's also their weakness. They think in patterns, and we're going to break those patterns." Eagle Soars stepped forward, his young face painted with war colors and set with determination. "Father, I want to be part of this. Whatever you're planning, I can help." Marcus felt his heart clench at the sight of his 16-year-old son volunteering for what might be a suicide mission. Every paternal instinct screamed at him to refuse, to keep his boy safe from the violence that was about to explode across the sacred ground. But Eagle Soars was right. He could help. And more than that, refusing him would mean treating him like a child, when he had already proven himself capable of adult responsibilities. 5 years of growing up without a father had forged the boy into someone who deserved respect rather than protection. "You'll follow my orders exactly," Marcus said finally. "No heroics, no individual initiative. This only works if we move as a single unit." Eagle Soars nodded solemnly. "I understand." As the warriors prepared for what might be their final battle, Marcus found himself thinking about the choices that had brought him to this moment. 5 years ago, he had left this sacred ground to honor a white man's dying wish, abandoning his family and his people for an abstract concept of duty. Now he was back, fighting alongside his son and his brother, to protect both his family and his principles simultaneously. The irony was profound and painful. It had taken the threat of complete destruction to show him that protecting strangers and protecting his own people weren't contradictory goals. They were part of the same fundamental obligation to stand between the strong and the weak, regardless of tribal boundaries. Gunfire erupted from the direction of the agency building as Sarah and her improvised defenders began their diversionary action. The sound was encouraging, multiple weapons firing in coordinated volleys, suggesting that the civilian defenders were indeed capable of making Kellerman's forces believe they faced serious resistance. "Here they come," Joseph said quietly, pointing toward movement in the smoke-filled settlement below. Kellerman's assault force was advancing in textbook formation, two fire teams providing covering positions, while a third moved forward to assault what they believed was the main Shoshone defensive position. The professionalism of their movement was impressive and terrifying, but it was also exactly what Marcus had hoped to see. "Remember," he told his warriors as the enemy drew closer, "wait for my signal. No matter what happens, wait for my signal." The advancing soldiers were close enough now that Marcus could see individual faces, hard men with the kind of competent confidence that came from years of successful violence. Their leader was a tall man with graying hair and the bearing of a professional military officer, probably one of the corrupt cavalry commanders that Sarah's documents had identified. 50 yards, 40, 30. The temptation to open fire was almost overwhelming, but Marcus forced himself to wait. His plan required letting the enemy get close enough to ensure that their superior firepower couldn't compensate for tactical surprise. 20 yards, 15. "Now!" Marcus shouted, and chaos erupted across the sacred ground as his desperate gamble unfolded with devastating effect. Instead of fighting a conventional defensive battle, the Shoshone warriors did something no military manual had ever contemplated. They charged directly into the teeth of the enemy assault, abandoning all cover and protection in favor of close-quarters combat that negated the attackers' advantages in weapons and coordination. The psychological impact was immediate and devastating. Kellerman's men had been trained to fight enemies, who behaved rationally, who sought cover and tried to minimize casualties. They were completely unprepared for defenders who rushed toward death with wild war cries and weapons designed for hand-to-hand combat. Marcus led the charge with his tomahawk, raised high, the weapon that had made him famous during the Indian Wars, now gleaming in the firelight from the burning buildings. Beside him, Eagle Soars moved with the fluid grace of youth, his bow sending arrows into the confused mass of attackers with deadly accuracy. The collision between the two forces was brutal and decisive. In close combat, the professional soldiers' advantages in training and equipment became liabilities. Rifles were too unwieldy for hand-to-hand fighting, and military discipline became useless when facing enemies who fought with the desperate fury of men protecting their families. Marcus's tomahawk found the throat of the enemy commander before the man could even raise his rifle. Joseph's lance pierced another soldier's chest, driving him backward into his companions. Thomas Black Elk, despite his missing arm, managed to tackle a third attacker and beat him senseless with the butt of his carbine. But the most devastating impact came from the complete breakdown of Kellerman's tactical plan. The assault force had been trained to advance under covering fire from their supporting positions, but the wild melee on the sacred ground made it impossible for their comrades to provide support without hitting their own men. Within minutes, the coordinated military assault had devolved into a confused brawl that favored the desperate defenders over the professional attackers. Kellerman's men began falling back, their formation shattered and their confidence broken by an enemy that refused to fight according to established rules. "Press them!" Marcus shouted, pursuing the retreating soldiers down the slope toward the burning settlement. "Don't let them regroup." But even as victory seemed within reach, Marcus could see new dangers developing. Kellerman himself had not yet appeared on the battlefield, which meant the master criminal was holding reserves for exactly this kind of tactical reversal. And the fires that continued to rage throughout the reservation were creating new hazards that could trap both attackers and defenders in a maze of smoke and flame. Most critically, the diversion at the agency building was beginning to falter. The sound of gunfire from that direction was becoming sporadic, suggesting that Sarah's improvised defenders were running low on ammunition or taking casualties that reduced their effectiveness. Marcus made a split-second decision that would determine the outcome of the entire battle. Instead of pursuing Kellerman's broken assault force, He turned his warriors toward the agency building where Sarah and the women and children were making their desperate stand. "This way," he called to his men. "We finish this where it started." As they raced through the smoke and chaos toward the final confrontation, Marcus felt the familiar mixture of fear and exhilaration that accompanied moments when everything balanced on the edge of a knife. In the next few minutes, they would either save their people and expose the conspiracy that threatened every Native American tribe in the territory, or they would die in the flames of their burning homes, taking their secrets to unmarked graves. But whatever happened, Marcus knew he was finally where he belonged, fighting alongside his son and his brother for his family and his people, with no contradiction between duty and love, no choice between strangers and blood. The crucible of battle had burned away. 5 years of doubt and self-recrimination, leaving only the essential truth that had always defined him. Some things were worth dying for, and those things included both protecting the innocent and defending those who could not defend themselves. The war cry that erupted from his throat as they charged toward the final battle carried all the pain and purpose of his long journey home. The agency building stood like a fortress under siege, its wooden walls pockmarked with bullet holes and its windows shattered by gunfire. But as Marcus and his warriors approached through the drifting smoke, they could still hear the steady crack of rifle fire from within. Sarah Mitchell and her civilian defenders were still alive and fighting. What they found when they reached the building's perimeter sent ice through Marcus's veins. Vincent Kellerman himself stood in the open doorway, his imposing figure silhouetted against the firelight from within. The master criminal held a revolver pressed against the temple of a small Shoshone girl, no more than 8 years old, while his remaining men kept their weapons trained on the women and children huddled inside. "Marcus Thunderheart," Kellerman called out, his voice carrying easily across the battlefield, despite the chaos around them. "I was wondering when you'd show up. Your reputation as a protector of the innocent is quite impressive. But let's see how far that protection extends when it might cost innocent lives." Marcus felt rage build in his chest as he recognized the child Kellerman was using as a human shield. Little Sparrow was the daughter of Mary Crow Feather, one of the women who had helped raise his own sons during his absence. The girl's dark eyes were wide with terror, but she remained silent and still, showing the kind of courage that made Marcus's heart ache with pride and fury. "Let her go, Kellerman," Marcus said, stepping into view with his weapons lowered but ready. "Your fight is with federal investigators and corrupt officials. These people have nothing to do with your conspiracy." Kellerman's laugh was utterly without humor. "On the contrary, Chief Thunderheart, these people have everything to do with my operations. Their land sits on mineral deposits worth millions of dollars. Their removal is essential to my business plans, and their deaths will eliminate any witnesses to Sarah Mitchell's inconvenient evidence." Behind Kellerman, Marcus could see the devastation inside the agency building. Several women lay motionless near the windows, their hunting rifles fallen from lifeless hands. Others pressed makeshift bandages to bleeding wounds while trying to comfort terrified children. And in the center of the chaos, Sarah Mitchell knelt beside a makeshift medical station, her dress torn and blood-stained, but her green eyes still blazing with determination. "The evidence has already been copied and sent to Washington," Sarah called out, her voice steady despite the gun barrel pressed against Little Sparrow's head. "Killing us won't stop the investigation. It will only add murder charges to your list of crimes." "Perhaps," Kellerman replied conversationally, "but dead witnesses can't testify in court, and dead federal investigators can't pursue appeals when corrupt judges dismiss their cases. Sometimes the simple solution is the most effective." Marcus made quick eye contact with Joseph, who had positioned himself behind an overturned wagon about 20 yards to Kellerman's left. His brother's slight nod indicated that he understood what needed to happen, but the timing would have to be perfect. One wrong move, and little Sparrow would die before anyone could save her. "You're not thinking clearly, Kellerman," Marcus said, taking a small step closer while keeping his voice calm and reasonable. "Massacring an entire reservation will bring federal attention you can't control. Corrupt officials can explain away missing investigators, but they can't explain away hundreds of dead Indians without triggering a congressional investigation." "Actually, they can," Kellerman replied with disturbing confidence. "The official report will describe a tragic uprising by violent savages who attacked peaceful government officials. Federal troops arrived too late to prevent the massacre but managed to restore order. Very sad, but these things happen on the frontier." The casual way he discussed mass murder revealed the true depth of Kellerman's evil. This wasn't a man driven by desperation or passion. He was a calculating predator who viewed human lives as obstacles to be eliminated with no more consideration than a farmer clearing rocks from a field. But Kellerman's arrogance also provided an opportunity. His need to explain and justify his actions suggested a man who craved recognition for his clever schemes. If Marcus could keep him talking while his warriors maneuvered into position. "Your plan has one fatal flaw," Marcus said, taking another step closer. "You're assuming your corrupt officials will remain loyal after tonight. But men who betray their government for money tend to save themselves when the situation becomes desperate." For the first time, uncertainty flickered across Kellerman's face. "What do you mean?" Marcus allowed himself a cold smile. "I mean Sarah's. Evidence includes financial records showing exactly which military officers and federal officials have been taking your money. When those men realize they're facing execution for treason, how long do you think their loyalty will last?" "You're bluffing," Kellerman said, but his grip on Little Sparrow tightened slightly. "Even if such records exist, they'd be hearsay without corroborating witnesses." "Would they?" Sarah interjected from inside the building. "Tell him about Colonel Richardson, Marcus. Tell him about the photographs." Marcus had no idea what Sarah was talking about, but he recognized a psychological warfare opportunity when he heard one. "Colonel Richardson was very cooperative once he understood the consequences of treason," he said with false confidence. "Amazing how quickly a man's principles change when he's facing a firing squad." The lie hit its target perfectly. Kellerman's face went pale as he realized that his conspiracy might already be unraveling. If one of his military collaborators had indeed been compromised, it would create a cascade of confessions as other conspirators rushed to save themselves. "Richardson wouldn't dare," Kellerman muttered, but his voice lacked conviction. "He's in too deep. The evidence against him is overwhelming." "Which is exactly why he's cooperating," Marcus replied smoothly. "Dead men can't spend British gold, Kellerman. Your people are going to abandon you the moment they realize their necks are in nooses." While this psychological battle continued, Marcus was aware of his warriors moving into position around the agency building. Thomas Black Elk had worked his way to a window on the building's south side, while Eagle Soars was approaching from the north with 3 other young warriors. Most importantly, Joseph had crept close enough to the doorway that he could intervene if Kellerman's attention was distracted for even a moment. The moment came when one of Kellerman's remaining men, a nervous-looking gunman with the shifty eyes of a career criminal, spoke up with obvious panic in his voice. "Boss, maybe we should get out of here. If the feds are already onto Richardson, they might be coming for us next. This whole job's gone to hell." "Shut up, Davis," Kellerman snapped, turning his head slightly to glare at his subordinate. "We finish this according to plan." The instant Kellerman's attention shifted, Joseph moved with the fluid grace that had made him famous as a warrior. His lance flew across the 20 yards, separating them with deadly accuracy, its steel point taking the nervous gunman in the chest before he could react. At the same moment, Marcus drew his tomahawk and hurled it in a spinning arc that ended, with the weapon's edge buried in the shoulder of another gunman. Eagle Soars and his companions burst through the building's side windows, their war cries filling the air as they fell on Kellerman's remaining men with devastating efficiency. But Kellerman himself reacted faster than Marcus had anticipated. Instead of trying to shoot little Sparrow in the chaos, he grabbed the child and used her as a shield, while backing toward a rear exit that would allow him to escape into the darkness beyond the burning settlement. "Very impressive, Chief Thunderheart," Kellerman called as he retreated, still holding his revolver to the girl's head. "But this changes nothing. Even if my current operation fails, there will be others. Your people's land will be stolen eventually. If not by me, then by someone else with better planning and more reliable associates." Marcus followed slowly, his hands visible and empty, while his mind raced through options for saving little Sparrow. Without triggering the child's execution, Kellerman was a professional criminal who understood the value of hostages, and he wouldn't hesitate to kill an innocent child if it served his purposes. "You're probably right," Marcus admitted, surprising Kellerman with his apparent agreement. "Men like you will always exist, looking for ways to profit from other people's suffering. But men like me will always exist too, standing between you and the people you want to hurt." "Noble sentiments," Kellerman replied mockingly, "but nobility doesn't stop bullets, and it doesn't prevent corruption. You can't protect everyone, Marcus. Eventually, you'll have to choose between your family and your principles again, and we both know which choice you'll make." The accusation cut deep because it carried an element of truth. Marcus had indeed abandoned his family once for abstract principles, and the pain of that choice still haunted him. But 5 years of exile had taught him something that Kellerman couldn't understand. Sometimes protecting your family and protecting your principles required the same actions. "You're right that I can't protect everyone," Marcus said quietly, still matching Kellerman's retreat step for step. "But I can protect this child, and I can protect my people, and sometimes that's enough." Behind Kellerman, Marcus could see movement in the shadows. Running Deer was approaching through the smoke with something in her hands. His wife had somehow circled around behind the criminal mastermind, moving with the stealth of someone who had learned hunting skills during their years together. But what truly shocked Marcus was what Running Deer carried. It wasn't a weapon, but a small leather pouch, one of the sacred medicine bundles that Shoshone healers used in their most powerful ceremonies. His wife was preparing to use spiritual warfare against an enemy who threatened her people's children. Kellerman was still backing toward what he thought was safety when Running Deer stepped out of the shadows directly behind him. Instead of attacking with a weapon, she opened the medicine bundle and blew its contents, a mixture of sacred herbs and blessed earth, directly into Kellerman's face while speaking words in the ancient Shoshone language that made the air itself seem to vibrate with power. The effect was immediate and dramatic. Kellerman stumbled backward, coughing and clawing at his eyes as the sacred mixture temporarily blinded him. His grip on little Sparrow loosened just enough for the child to twist free and run toward Marcus's outstretched arms. But even blinded and disoriented, Kellerman was still dangerous. He fired his revolver wildly, the bullets going wide but coming close enough to force Marcus and little Sparrow to dive for cover behind a pile of grain sacks. "Running Deer, get down!" Marcus shouted, but his wife was already moving, rolling away from Kellerman's position as the criminal mastermind continued firing in her general direction. The gunfire stopped abruptly as Kellerman's revolver clicked empty. Marcus heard the sound of the weapon hitting the ground, followed by Kellerman's voice raised in desperate negotiation. Wait, don't shoot. I can give you information. Names, dates, bank accounts, everything you need to expose the entire conspiracy. Marcus rose cautiously from behind his cover, keeping little Sparrow protected while he assessed the situation. Kellerman stood swaying in the open ground between the burning buildings, his face streaked with tears from Running Deer's medicine bundle, his hands raised in surrender. "The conspiracy goes deeper than you know," Kellerman continued desperately. "Federal judges, territorial governors, even senators in Washington. I have records of every payment, every favor, every crime. Kill me, and you'll never find them all." It was a compelling offer. Kellerman clearly did possess information that could expose corruption throughout the territorial government. Keeping him alive might be the key to protecting not just the Shoshone reservation, but every Native American community threatened by similar schemes. But Marcus also remembered the casual way Kellerman had discussed massacring innocent families, the cold calculation with which he had used a child as a human shield. Some crimes were too heinous to be forgiven, regardless of their strategic value to the prosecution of other criminals. "Joseph," Marcus called to his brother, who was approaching with several other warriors. "Take him alive. Sarah will need him to testify about the conspiracy." Joseph nodded grimly and moved to secure the prisoner, but Kellerman had one final surprise. As the war chief approached, the criminal mastermind pulled a hidden derringer from his boot and aimed it directly at little Sparrow, who was still sheltered in Marcus's arms. "I don't think so," Kellerman snarled, his facade of defeated cooperation falling away to reveal the true monster beneath. "If I'm going to hang for treason, I'm taking some of you savages with me." The derringer's barrel was aimed directly at the child's head from less than 10 feet away, an impossible shot to miss. Marcus could see Kellerman's finger tightening on the trigger, could see the mad hatred burning in the man's eyes as he prepared to murder an innocent child out of pure spite. But the shot that echoed across the battlefield didn't come from Kellerman's weapon. Sarah Mitchell stood in the doorway of the agency building, a smoking rifle in her hands and a look of cold satisfaction on her face. Her bullet had taken Kellerman's center mass, spinning him around and dropping him face first into the dirt where he lay motionless, the derringer falling from lifeless fingers. "Some crimes don't deserve a trial," Sarah said simply, lowering her weapon, "and some criminals are too dangerous to be allowed to live." Marcus felt a complex mixture of relief, gratitude, and moral uncertainty as he looked down at Kellerman's body. The man had been a monster who deserved death for his crimes, but killing him had also eliminated a valuable source of information about the broader conspiracy. "Is it over?" Little Sparrow asked in a small voice, looking up at Marcus with the kind of trust that made his heart ache with protective fury. "It's over," Marcus assured her, holding the child close while his family and his warriors gathered around them in the growing dawn light. "The bad men are gone, and they won't hurt anyone else." But even as he spoke the comforting words, Marcus knew the larger battle was just beginning. Kellerman's death had eliminated the immediate threat, but the conspiracy he had led involved dozens of corrupt officials throughout the territorial government. Exposing them all would require careful investigation, political maneuvering, and probably more violence before justice was finally served. Still, looking around at his family and his people, bruised, bloodied, but alive and victorious, Marcus felt something he hadn't experienced in 5 years. Complete peace with his choices. He had protected the innocent without abandoning his own people. He had honored his promise to Colonel Harrison while fulfilling his obligations as a husband and father. Running Deer approached him slowly, her face streaked with smoke and tears, but her eyes shining with something that might have been pride. "Welcome home, Marcus," she said softly, placing her hand over his heart in the traditional gesture of a wife, acknowledging her husband's return from war. I'm sorry it took me so long to find my way back, Marcus replied, his voice thick with emotion. You found your way when we needed you most, Running Deer corrected gently. That's what matters. As the sun rose over the Shoshone reservation, painting the smoke-filled sky in shades of gold and crimson, Marcus Thunderheart stood surrounded by his family and his people, no longer torn between competing loyalties, but finally at peace with the man he had chosen to become. The crucible of battle had burned away his doubts and shown him the truth he had been seeking for 5 years. Sometimes the greatest act of love is standing ready to die for those who cannot protect themselves, whether they share your blood or not. The war was over, but the healing was just beginning. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe. And turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.